keynotes now. So we have API discoverability and REST API profile for the public sector. And I would like to invite Bogdan and Lorenzino soonish on the stage. There you are. And this topic, this is like a little bit, it's not rolling out of my tongue, let's say. It's a bit heavy to start with after lunch or maybe during lunch for some of you. But I know that this is this is a continuing saga, I should say, by the European Commission and you guys to take a deep dive into the public sector and how API should build, isn't it? So can you tell a little bit about why this topic today? So we have here Lorenzino and we have Bogdan. So Bogdan,
indeed, let me take then the challenge, and I understand it's mainly good afternoon for most of the audience, although it's still morning on our side of the world. But we're very happy to be here with you, and also honored to have this first stab at the conference. Yes, we are working in a joint project between the Joint Research Council that my colleague Lorenzino is representing and Digit that I'm representing. That is funded from a program that was active still last year to look more closely into how to standardize the use of REST APIs, particularly for public administration in Europe. But of course, the work we are doing is, while targeting the public administration, it is certainly not limited to the public administration, neither to that of Europe or anywhere else. It can also be used elsewhere. Because in the end, the goal is, let's try to do things in a similar way when we deploy REST APIs without stepping on anybody's specific project. So we are trying to see what is horizontal, what is shareable across virtually every project out there, and try to come to some sort of a consensus, at least to start the ball rolling in the public sector that can lead us to this consensus. And this is just let's say a slice into that work that we are presenting today, into the both tracks of work, the one on the discoverability and other segments done by JRC, and then on the REST API profile done by us in Digit. So I'm not sure if we are still in the discussion mode or we go directly into the presentation. I'll let you maybe.
Yeah, I would like to just kind of bring a little bit of background to this, because this is not the first time when you guys are here, or especially when Lorenzino is here in Apidays Helsinki and North. So I know that last year we had you guys explaining kind of, and we even had a previous year workshop, and you guys had a round of workshops in the API Days events, and then of course last year they were virtual. But can you kind of, Lorenzino, explain a little bit about the background? So what you have been doing together with API Days, and also what is the kind of bigger picture here?
Hello, everybody. I'm Lorenzino Vaccari from the Joint Research Center. As Mariuka was saying, you know me from previous edition of API's Days.
I know you, and I still got you here. Yeah, continue.
I mean, we started the journey with the API Days more than a couple of years ago. We contacted Mehdi at the beginning because we were searching for the API landscape for government, let's say, and we found a nice picture with the API landscape of the companies and so on. So we called and we started a collaboration because we thought that the private sector could help a lot in transmitting and in transferring the knowledge that they have acquired since more than 20 years ago to the public sector. And as well, the public sector has the goal to improve public services. And how to do this, I mean, and which are the specific policy issues that can be discussed with the private sector. This was the main problem that we discussed, and we say, how can we solve this? So let's start organizing even together workshop in which the private sector and the public sector, they discuss together. They pose the problems and they find solutions. And today we are talking about some of them.
Yes, and it has been really interesting to kind of follow the journey of like what was the very kind of, it was a little bit even chaotic beginning when everybody was kind of trying to find what are the problems or what are the issues and who is building APIs around Europe, and that was kind of almost a detective work type of stuff in the beginning. And now we are seeing it all come together and kind of be more established, and it has been really interesting to kind of have that workshop, for example, that we had after last year's API Days Helsinki event, that really kind of dig deep into the topics and into the problems, especially from the public sector point of view. But today, before I let you loose on your presentation, so one thing that I wanted to just say, because I know that last year you published the framework on public sector and APIs, and that has really been used in at least some of the European Union countries. I know, because in Finland there has been a work going on since last year on creating these API guidelines and API policies for the Finnish public sector, and I'm really happy to say that after you guys kind of dive in deep on what the European Commission is doing and this particular API discoverability problem, then we will have Miina Arajärvi from the Finnish government, from Ministry of Finance in Finland, explain how that kind of framework and all of the stuff that you guys have been doing has maybe influenced the Finnish government and the policies that are being set in place, and why those kind of guidelines should be used or are maybe useful for the public sector in any country, basically. So with that note, let's get you going with your presentation. Are you ready?
Yes, certainly.
Perfect.
Okay, I will start, and then I will very quickly hand over to Lorenzino. So once again, well, good afternoon or possibly good morning for some of you still. And we are Bogdan, Dumitriu, and Lorenzino Vaccari. I'm working as a project officer in Digits at the European Commission, and my colleague as a consultant in the Joint Research Center, that is an independent body also of the European, let's say, institutions. We will speak about the discoverability of APIs on the one hand, and on the REST API profile that we have been piloting on the other hand, for the public sector. Let me already get started very quickly here. So what we are presenting today is something that is going on at the moment at the European level, with the aim to guide governments as they look into using APIs. And the work we are talking about has two separate strands. One of them is done by the Joint Research Council, and the other one by Digit, which is part of the Commission that functions, let's say, more or less like a digital agency. The work that is done on the JRC side looks into essentials related to APIs that government organizations need to be concerned about when they implement their digital agendas. But what does this really mean? It's a nice sounding pitch, but what does it really entail? So first of all, they cover technical essentials, then they cover legal essentials and organizational essentials. On the technical side, they want to see how do you manage the life cycle of APIs, because of course, without life cycle management, just throwing an API out there and then expecting it to not have to be, let's say, maintained over time and put through various statuses is probably not a good way to go about APIs, especially where governments are concerned. Then how do you discover APIs? Because it's only if you enable discoverability that you can foster an API ecosystem. And this is what Lorenzino, of course, will dive into in a moment. Then how do you secure APIs? And I guess this goes without saying. I mean, there is not really a lot of need to dwell on why do we have to secure APIs, but how do we do it is maybe the right question. And finally, how do we address, as governments, the concerns about privacy on the one hand, because of course we have very strict data protection guidelines in Europe, but also traceability, because if somebody has access to data or creates accesses, does anything with data, essentially, it's important that this can be traced and in case issues or challenges appear, there is a trace. And of course, then there are the legal and organizational aspects, which are also very relevant when governments set out to provision and use APIs. And then on the side of digits, we have, let's say, we are the younger addition to this work. And I will present what we are doing in the second half of today's presentation, but we are focusing on common technical guidelines. So we work at a much lower level, in a sense, much more applied level, where we want to say, well, what is exactly the way that you can use APIs if you are government especially, and what kind of choices can we realistically make for you so that you don't have to, reinvent the wheel every time. So we look at the most salient technical standards in the area of REST APIs, and from there we try to collect everything in a coherent profile. And of course, we also make choices on how to use the standards where possible. So with this, I leave you in the capable of hands of Lorenzino for the first half of the presentation to talk about discoverability, and then I will be back to speak to you about the API profile. Lorenzino?
And thanks a lot for the introduction, Bogdan, and hi everybody. I'm glad to be here today with you to show some of the results in the field of discoverability of APIs in government. But before this, let me summarize the context of our work. Since 3 years ago at the Joint Research Center, we started our journey in investigating the motivations behind the use of APIs in governments. We discovered that API supports government to obtain its digital transformation, let's say, in various ways. They let governments control and monitoring the digital environments, and they also enhance policy-making innovation by optimizing information to support decision-making and monitoring of processes. They are connected nodes between processes. They also transform governments into robust digital systems, and they enable public administration to be flexible and to take with current and future advancing technologies, such, for example, artificial intelligence, and to be able to rewire the interaction with other public sector administrations, the business, the private companies, and ultimately the citizens with the public services. Next slide, please, Bogdan. Thanks a lot. So API gives to the public sector some opportunities. I here summarize some of them and make some examples that we investigated on during our study. First of all, they enable digital ecosystem, as I said, like in the case of at the X-Road of architecture and infrastructure of Estonia. It connects their public administration with IT systems within and outside their government. And second, they also foster innovation in the public sector. They make internal processes more flexible and harmonized. And they also make the provision of public services to be extensible and reusable by the private sector, like in the case, for example, of the city of Zaragoza, and in the public transportation department and of the city of Madrid. They open their APIs, they release their datasets and digital assets, and this led both the public sector and the private sector to develop their application for final users in different topics, like the ones that you are seeing watching on the examples, let's say. But also they can give more new economic opportunities, helping small and medium enterprises to reduce the cost of establishing and running their businesses. And they make it easier to access open data that can further stimulate new economic development. This is what we saw, for example, in the API Agro with some middleware they created to link the public sector and the private sector. And all in all, we concluded in the previous part of the study, let's say, that APIs are one of the most useful technical enablers for the digital transformation in governments. I here summarize some recommended action we give recently. The main ones regard the fact that APIs must be explicitly adopted in governments. Sometimes, as Marco Panebianco of the Regione Lombardia says, APIs are considered like interfaces without a face, right? You don't see them, but they are behind the front end and they enable all interaction between different actors and systems. They make also, let's say, they create and improve the API culture in governments because this is a main requirement that has to be done in governments to
push and to create APIs. It is not sufficient only to talk about open data, but we have to find a way to publish them in a interactive and productive way. And the other recommendation is also about that the governments, they must become digital ecosystem aware by engaging both the public government actors and the private sector, not only by providing these APIs openly to the external world, but also to organizing and participating to this kind of events as the ones that we are participating today. But to do this, I mean, we made explicit this recommendation I'm talking about by using the framework that Mariuka was talking before. And I know today that it was used by the Finland government as well, and we are really happy for this, because this framework comes from an analysis of more than 3,000 documents from the private and public sector. So let's now focus on the topic of today, that, as Bogdan was saying, is related to the discoverability of APIs. This topic is part of our current focus on some specific API essentials, as suggested also by the API framework I mentioned 2 seconds ago. We are currently analyzing the technical aspects related to the API lifecycle management, such as their discoverability and their specifications. Also, we are analyzing the issues about the cybersecurity and traceability of the use of APIs and the digital assets they share. We are also dealing with the analysis of API legal and organizational aspects, such as the protection of privacy, also required by the GDPR regulation, and the legal framework of APIs, including their licensing, service level agreements, and terms of services, plus the analysis of specific API-driven ecosystems, like the one of the financial sector, that is related to the Last Payment Services Directive, or PSD2. So next slide, please. Thanks a lot. So, as I said, we strongly collaborated during the last year with the API Days team on these aspects and organized 3 main events in the past months. In the first workshop, the public sector defined and presented some main issues related to the technical aspects I have listed before. And these issues were discussed in a panel made of worldwide experts, including Mariuka Ninioka and Alan Glickenhaus. In the second workshop was about the other side of the coin of the technical aspects. This time, the private sector presented some solutions to the issues gathered in the previous events. We invited Eric Wild, that talked about API lifecycle management, Isabel Mooney, that illustrated how API security can be tackled in organizations, and Darrell Miller, which presented the main pillars about open API specification. In the third workshop, as Bogdan was saying, we had just a few weeks ago, we discussed about the legal and organizational aspects, and in particular the regulatory perspective regarding the General Data Protection Regulation and the PSD2 directive, and also the last EU policies for its data strategy. But let's now go in deep and present some results of our investigation on API discoverability aspects. We have found that API discoverability tools can be clustered into many classes, of which the main ones are used to publish API as a product, as we see on the left part of the screen. And also, APIs can be clustered in catalogs, and mainly that we found mainly focused catalogs on the sharing of open data. But they can also be published as, let's say, websites that engage and involve an entire digital ecosystem, as in the case of the region Lombardia in Italy. In the first case, I also published the case of the French government that collected the different APIs from different departments and of the government and put all them together and linked them with data and final services. So in the next slide, please. Okay, so I here put mainly the main statistics on a distilled set of API portals and websites we have collected. Others are available, and we publish a public report by the end of 2021 and beginning of 2022. The government API portals are mainly at the national level, but we have also found that many cases are at the city level, as you can see from the graphs.
Many portals are API directories or registries, like in the case of the French government. They are catalogs, and a few of them are also for business users, not only, let's say, directed for only for developers. Quite a lot of them are published within an open data platform. And about the use of standards, we have also discovered that in many cases, and I mean, we selected only 40 cases, but just in these cases, we have observed that the OpenAPI specifications are quite used a lot to define and implement APIs. In the next slide, I show that a summary of the interviews of some governments that are providing these cases and on which we have investigated in detail experiences. At the city level, we contacted the cities of Antwerp, Zaragoza, and New York outside Europe. Antwerp published a platform portal that collects all the government APIs. We would like to highlight that they use artificial intelligence, natural language processing techniques to discover and match their APIs, which is quite interesting. Zaragoza also published their open data with APIs. They make them immediately stable, used by app developers. They also push a stronger community of practices. New York has an API product-oriented page and clearly defined the intended audience for each APIs, with the some domains, they cluster APIs in domains. They register current partners and describe API feature also in non-technical language. So also here we see a business direction, let's say, of API, the business explanation of APIs. At the regional level, I talked about it in the previous slide. I mean, we interviewed the region the Lombardia in Italy that publishes the API within an ecosystem view and use also some user-friendly interfaces and some storytelling techniques. Then we have some cases at national level, like the one of Statistical Office of Denmark that provides a well-documented API portal. The French one published a user-friendly portal at the whole of government level. The Netherlands provide an API developer portal, also gathering API from different situations and from regional and city levels. And then we have also an example of the government of Victoria in Australia that has also developed a developer portal to collect APIs from all over the government, and they have a clear and user-friendly interface as well. So, and then in the next slide, I just summarize some conclusion. For the sake of time, I put here the main ones. I have presented only a few results of the analysis we have done, and if you want to know more, of course, please contact us. The main conclusion about API discoverability in governments are that the developer portals are currently the most used way to share APIs outside governments. But they are not the only one. There are also portals that are for business users. Also, the API discoverability tools in government are mostly targeting internal audience, but we have noticed that the trend is to consider APIs as enablers also for externally and government, let's say, and specific departments and at the whole of government level. And moreover, API discoverability processes are growing to support digital government ecosystems. But last but not least, we found that in one case, discoverability of APIs was enabled by the use of artificial intelligence techniques. I thank you for your attention. This was my last slide. And I would like also to thank Monica Posada for the leadership of the API project, Dietmar Garwinkel of our partner DG Connect, and Mark Boyd, on which collaboration the majority of the API discoverability investigation results are based. I now pass back the screen to Bogdan for the second part of the presentation.
Thank you, Lorenzino. And I will just start by saying that I apologize if some of you have seen the first couple of slides I'm showing today because they are needed for context, but let's go in any case. So my colleague, of course, presented an overview on the discoverability guidelines, but for the remainder of the presentation, I will switch gears a little bit and turn to the work that has taken place in Digit to define the REST API profile, which is, as I was mentioning in the introduction, a little bit at a lower level. So to understand the context where we are doing this work, I need to take a brief detour and present you with, let's say, the more established solutions that we've already spent some years building, And they take the form of what we call the CEF building blocks, CEF being the name of the Connecting Europe Facility program that has financed their development. And they are essentially solutions that were jointly developed by the member states, or by some of the member states of the European Union. And then later on, they were transferred for, let's say, custodianship to the European Commission. As you see on the right-hand side, these are typically horizontal building blocks that are needed in virtually any domain, whether dealing with health, taxation, justice, or whatever may be. Among them, we have the delivery building block, which is, let's say, the even lower level context where we are carrying out the work on the REST API profile. And it provides the delivery building block an interoperable approach to secure the communication between systems, between heterogeneous systems deployed usually cross-border, cross-ministries, cross-whatever, over an open network, typically, of course, the internet. And the delivery approaches the middle layer between the backend, the business and sector-specific applications, on the one hand, which we do not really inform in any way, so they are completely independent, and then the communication network on the lower level of the picture. And the model of e-delivery is that of a peer-to-peer network of access points that communicate to each other using a standard protocol, the so-called AS4 protocol, which is both an OASIS standard and, as of this year, actually also an ISO standard. But we don't use it in its let's say, defined form as it is in OASIS, but we specialize it in a certain way, not breaking it in any way, of course, but profiling it, specializing it, so that various choices, for instance, what encryption algorithm are you using, are already made, so that there is no lack of interoperability in practice. But as it is not the focus of today's presentation, I will stop here with let's say, the e-delivery context, and just highlight that it is an AS4, that AS4 is a SOAP-based protocol. But this being the case, our users, of course, requested that we also support in the building block, not just a SOAP-based protocol, but also a REST-based approach, and also standardize it in a way that makes it interoperable across domains. So the question we asked ourselves is, how do we expand the delivery concept, which I briefly mentioned, to enable additional communication patterns using REST APIs? And furthermore, what kind of technological choices can we make that are, let's say, domain agnostic? We don't want to say how the health people should be structuring their endpoints, or how the taxation people should be. We just want to say, if there is a way that everybody can be interoperable at a certain level, then we need to leave all the freedom to the projects, to the sectors, to the domains to define then their domain-specific needs. But of course, we want to do this in an interoperable way, in a secure way, in a reliable way, and arrive at trusted APIs. So the goal finally was to pilot a REST API profile, and I use this word profile, but I would like to take the time to explain it. It's really to say, how do you use a specific standard? Because standards have areas that are unspecified, and it's always that the devil is in the details that hides in those areas. So when we take a standard and we want to propose it for use, we want to say, okay, how can we use that standard in a particular way so that everybody makes the same choices, or follows the same choices, right? So this is what we set out to do, and of course, when doing so, we looked at the functional and non-functional requirements in e-delivery at large, and we say, or let's say, we see what the current profile that we had, that the SOAP-based one, the AS4 one, covers. So very briefly, we talk about server-to-server exchanges. So in the AS4 case, we are targeting that both ends to the communication will typically be server environments. We are, of course, relying or enforcing secure delivery by doing encryption at several levels. We want to have reliable and non-repudiable delivery. This means that there is a requirement that there is a signed receipt, acknowledgement receipt, from the party that receives a message or a piece of data to the one sending it, so that there is a legal accountability for the transmission of that message. We target typically, let's say, enterprise environments. Of course, business agnostic or business agnosticity remains a driving force. And finally, as I mentioned, technologically speaking, it's based on SOAP and WS security. But when we look at the REST API profile that we wanted or we want to create to augment the AS4.1, we need to respond to different needs, because just doing the same in a different technology was not at all interesting. So what are those needs? The way we captured those needs is by introducing this, let's say, term light context, because we say we want the REST API profile to address cases where at least one of the parties to the communication is constrained. What do we mean? I mean, typically, what you mean is that you are talking about a browser, you're talking about a mobile phone application, you are talking about possibly a client-only environment where you cannot really expose any type of endpoints. So when you keep this constraint in mind, then you need to model your approach to REST APIs in a certain fashion so that you can also cater to these use cases. It does not mean, on the other hand, that the profile we are trying to build is exclusively targeting those deployment topologies, but it does constrain what we do because we want to also service those deployment technologies. So this is, let's say, the two sides of the coin that we are trying to put together. On the one hand side, as I mentioned, we have the interest to have a standardized data exchange up to a certain level. Of course, there will always be room for business-specific formats and message patterns and so on. But at least at a certain level, we want standardization. Or when I say standardization, I mean the use of similar standards. We are not a standardization body, so we select, we profile, and then we recommend the use of a certain set of standards. Then we want business agnostic data exchange, because we need to allow the rollout of the profile in any sector of government business, let's say. And finally, we want, of course, to promote secure data exchange. This goes without saying. But the other side of the coin, as I said, is that we want to in the REST API approach, to do it with ease of deployment of installation. Typically, it should be a zero configuration. There should be no certificates involved and so forth. We want to rely on let's say, we want to permit operation on mobile and personal environments. And we want to provide updated options for data exchange patterns on top of those that are already part of the building block supported by AS4. And this comes together in what we are calling the REST API profile. And while it's not yet completed and published, it is well advanced enough that I can present you the approach we have taken, and just give you a very, very quick, I would say, presentation of what we are doing. So the concept that we addressed is that we see the profile in three concentric circles, where we say that different projects can choose to target different levels of conformance. The inner circle, which is, let's say, the minimal conformance that you may be aspiring to, is the core profile, and that's where we simply define a set of cross-cutting concerns having to do with security, for instance, versioning, and so forth. Then we have the second level, which has to do with documentation. It's based on adopting an open API specification approach, and we create some rules for how you should structure your open API document. So to clear things up a bit, if you're only targeting level 1, we will put some constraints that you need to have documentation, but how you build your documentation is pretty much open-ended. If you're targeting a level 2 type conformance, then we also are opinionated about how you should do your open API document. And finally, we see in certain contexts, of course, that REST APIs could be deployed also where you want to interlink different data exchange networks, some of which may be REST API based, some of which may be using different technologies. And there needs to be some kind of transfer of data between networks. And that's, I mean, typically the scenario where we want to also focus on a messaging API specification. So, of course, you can still do REST APIs in the classical sense by just targeting level 1 or level 2 conformance. But if you want to do a messaging using REST API, so a messaging type approach, then we also have a set of endpoint definitions that cover this. I will just give you brief examples because we cannot really get in depth. I mean, we have 10 minutes here, so we cannot get into a lot of details. But to make you understand the three levels I have presented a little bit more intimately. So when we talk about level 1, as I said, we cover topics such as authentication, authorization. We build on OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect. Security, lifecycle management, common semantics, what type of HTTP verbs should we use, how do we deal with the typical resource patterns, how do we deal with identifiers, with collections, etc. Of course, the fact that there must be documentation, and also to make the link with what my colleague was presenting, how do you promote discoverability in a REST API? So these are all topics that are covered in the core profile, as we call it. And to give you a more concrete example, if I take the topic of lifecycle management, just as one of many, then we would have some guidelines on how you should deal with versioning, how you should deal with backward compatibility. We introduce specific HTTP headers for deprecation and sunsetting of an API. We provide even a property extension for the lifecycle of an API, which we mandate to be used if our profile is followed, so that, let's say, a government API can indicate its level of maturity at a certain moment in time. Another example, of course, is that of discoverability, where we say, well, to facilitate discoverability, the API must, first of all, have an open API document accessible at a specific URL. It must include certain information about the deployment, the instances where it was deployed, and things like who published it and what the life cycle is. Then we have, of course, rules about documentation, where we say what is allowed, what must be used, what is forbidden, what are the best practices, and we even include some extensions. I cannot dwell too much on this because I see I am at the limit of the time, so I will just very briefly end with a point on the messaging API specification. And again, I cannot get into details, but we define a set of endpoints and some semantics around those endpoints that can be used to facilitate the deployment of a messaging-oriented API. And as, let's say, a check after the presentation resource, please have a look at this URL, the join up URL that you see in the lower bottom corner of the slide. You also have the QR code where you will find a lot of the material that we have hinted at during this presentation. And this is, of course, where you can get later information or further information after this conference. Thank you very much. I think probably Q&A will not be possible, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I think we'll have time to take like really short questions before Mina's presentation. So there are 2 questions, and you can feel free to answer them in the chat later. But there is a question from Alan Knabe about what is the best way to make your APIs discoverable, portals versus catalogs versus ecosystem. I think that is a kind of a general question, but if you want to answer that, and then there's another one which is related to the discoverability. So what is an AI-assisted discoverability function? So if you could just give a brief answer to those.
I suggest, Lorenzino, maybe you take the question.
Yeah, I think if Lorenzino can.
Sorry, the fact is that during the last 30-40 seconds, I couldn't hear the question. So can you summarize it again, please?
Yes.
Mariuka, there was an interruption, a blocking screen. So,
okay.
Yeah, please.
So what is an AI-assisted discoverability function, and what are the best ways to make your APIs discoverable, portal versus catalog versus ecosystem?
So am I understood correctly, the AI discoverability function?
Yeah.
It's about artificial intelligence. Yes. I mean, we had this great experience with Antwerp. We had an interview with them, and they actually said that some business, let's say, users, they would like to find the best API for their final application, for the public service, right? So they had a text describing the functionalities of the API they would like to find. And then they use NLP techniques to interpret this text and compare this text with the OpenAPI specification file. And they could find the best matching API based on the specification, the formal specification, with the initial text. So that they had a kind of ranking, like at the Google style, let's say, that rank these APIs based on a text that they had as a requirement. This was quite interesting. We had some other experiments in the project in which we tried to find let's say, a semantic similarity between OpenAPI specification and text. But let's say this is an open research field that I think should be I mean, investigated a bit more. But it was nice to see how concretely a city would use the artificial intelligence to do this. Have I answered the question?
Yeah, thank you about the artificial intelligence. Of course, there's a whole lot to investigate there because of the also AI being used in the designs of APIs and all of that. But we are running out of time. So if you or the other members of the audience would like to answer Alan's question about what is the best way, portals or catalogs or ecosystems to discover APIs, that would be great. And then also there's a few comments from there about the REST API profile that are saying that this is really great work. And then also please share the slides was one of the questions. And we will share slides after the event of all the speakers who want them to be shared. And also these recordings will come out after the event. But if you guys have anything to share, please put it into the event chat in Hopin after this. But thank you, Lorenzino and Bogdan. It has been a pleasure to have you here in Helsinki virtually, as we are used to doing.